I'm Chris Bray. I'm a wildlife photographer. I live here on beautiful Christmas Island. I've probably seen the red crab migration 3 or 4 times now. It's a spectacular event to see. 20 or even 50 million red crabs all coming out of their jungle homes and scurrying down to the coast to then release billions of eggs into the sea. It's a pretty crazy time of year, actually. For tourists particularly, everyone wants to get the best shot. So sometimes even on the spawning morning, there can be 4 or 5 film crews around, IMAX, BBC, and they've all got their lights up and camera crews everywhere, and it's a bit tricky, but there's always beautiful little beaches somewhere on Christmas Island where there's no one, so you can always find that and then have a whole beach to yourself, so it's pretty special. The island definitely changes during crab migration. Logistically, a lot of the roads close so that the crabs can safely cross without getting run over, so you need to have a lot more patience when you're driving around. Certainly tourism gets a little bit crazy, but for the locals it's just life as normal and they just carry on. It's the sheer numbers of crabs involved that make this event so spectacular to see. 50 million crabs all walking down out of the jungle. It's timed to the phase of the moon. There's a particular tide that the crabs need to have to release their eggs. It's the last quarter of the moon, the spring tide associated with that, and they have to spawn before dawn as well. So it's this real particular time that all the crabs are aiming for. It's amazing synchronicity for them to be able to do that all together. They have to wait for the rains to start though. That's what triggers the whole thing. So it can be quite unpredictable. It's either going to be in like October, November, January, February, but you don't really know. It's because you've got to wait for the rain, which makes it quite tricky for tourism to try and work out. If people say, oh, when I want to come and see the crab spawn, when is that? And you don't really know. It could be in any of these months. So yeah, it makes it a little bit tricky. But once it starts, then it's just the crabs in the center of the island head out first, and they just gradually start flowing out towards the coast, picking up all the other crabs as they go. And by the time they get to the coast and mate, and then develop their eggs and spawn, the whole coastline can just be red with crabs. But even more spectacular, I think, than the adult migration, after the eggs are cast into the sea, they hatch instantly and swim around for 3 or 4 weeks as little megalopes, like plankton. And then, if they're lucky, if the ocean currents go the right way, they drift back to the island. And then one morning you just wake up and the whole coastline can be red with tiny little baby crabs, like a living carpet, just flowing out onto the beaches and the rocks and making their way back up into the jungle. I think that's, even more amazing than the adult migration. It's incredible. Most people, when they think of crabs, I guess they think of rock pools and coastal crabs living in the surf. These crabs are different. They're land crabs, so they live their whole life up in the jungle. They live in burrows down in the soil. They just pop out and eat leaves and things like that, but they still have that link back to their ancestry where they have to get back to the coast to spawn. Their eggs have to start life in the sea, so that's why every year all the crabs have to do this epic migration. Christmas Island red crabs only live here on Christmas Island, and there's nowhere else in the world where there's a migration of such huge numbers of crabs. So after the females have mated and developed their eggs, and then they're getting ready to spawn them into the sea, as soon as the eggs hit the seawater, they hatch and turn into these little megalope, like plankton, and they drift around out at sea for a while, about 3 or 4 weeks. And then it's all dependent on the luck of the tide and the currents. If the currents are bad, sometimes the babies just never come back to the island. Some years, a couple of them come back, but some years, like the last couple of years, it's been a massive return, and billions of these tiny little red baby crabs all wash up one morning, and you can get the whole beaches and whole rocky coastlines can just be red with these tiny little baby crabs all marching up the rocks and off into the jungle. It's incredible to see. I think it's more spectacular than the adult migration. So the whole epic event is kicked off by the rain, and we don't really know when the rain is going to come each year. Could be October, November, December, January, so it's hard to predict. But when the rain does come, all the crabs as one start moving out of the forest down to the coast, males and females together basically, and they'll often dip in the water just briefly to get wet, and then they come back to the shoreline. The males dig a mating burrow, and then they mate. The males then go home, and the females hide in that mating burrow and develop their eggs for about 2 weeks. And then just at the right time, ready for that particular tide that's correct to spawn on, the last quarter of the moon, a spring tide, just before dawn. Then all the females come out and clamber out onto these rocks and just cover the whole coastline red. And then just at the right time of the tide, they all run out and cast their eggs into the sea, do a bit of a dance and shake all the eggs out. And then they've got to be really careful not to drown, in fact, because they're land crabs now, so they can't breathe underwater, they drown. So they're really hanging on really carefully to all the rocks and trying not to get swept out to sea. But hopefully they release their eggs, and then they just head off up into the jungle and then start that epic return migration all the way home. So the Christmas Island red crab, it's quite a big crab. Its carapace can be about that kind of size, and then the nippers, you know, they're quite big. And when they're migrating, they just cover the whole roads everywhere. It's hard to even walk around or cycle around. It's really tricky. And of course the cars have to stop. National parks close a lot of the roads, which makes it a little bit harder to get around the island. You've got to be a bit more patient. But tourists love it, you know, getting out in front of the car and having to rake the crabs out of the way so you can safely drive in. It's all part of the experience. Good. Christmas Island is a fascinating place. It's called the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. It's got so much more than just these red crabs. Incredible wildlife. The diving is world class. You get whale sharks swimming around. The bird life is incredible. So many different endemic species, beautiful birds with long golden tails, and it's just like a nature tourist delight here. We started to build an eco lodge on the coast inside the national park last year, and that's been a great experience, and everyone is absolutely loving it. The island is only just growing up into tourism now, and I think it's going to be a spectacular destination to visit. Experiencing one of these red crab migrations has been a highlight for me, absolutely. There's nothing quite like sitting on the coast there, being surrounded by thousands, millions of these red crabs all getting ready to spawn. It's like being in the middle of a nature documentary. As a kid, I grew up with the David Attenborough documentaries, and he came to Christmas Island, and I remember that, sitting amongst all those crabs. So to be a part of that, and to live in an island where this happens every year is incredible. I'm Chris Bray, I'm a wildlife photographer, and I live on Christmas Island here. I've probably seen the red crab migration 3 or 4 times. It's a pretty spectacular event, anywhere between 20 and 50 million red crabs all swarming down to the coast from their forest burrows. It's incredible to see. The migration happens sometime between November and January, and it can be a bit of a mad scramble. A lot of tourists come to the island then, and everyone's trying to get photos and videos. Sometimes you go down to the beach in the morning of the spawning, and there could be 4 or 5 different film crews, IMAX, BBC, and everyone's trying to get the best shot with their lighting. But everyone's pretty respectful, and there's always heaps of little beaches on Christmas Island where you can go to where there's no one and get some footage on your own as well. But it's certainly an interesting time of year. It doesn't really affect some of the locals so much because they're just used to it, so they just keep doing their thing. But certainly the tourism operators, we're building an eco lodge here, and so for us it involves a lot more logistical difficulties to get around the island because they close a lot of the roads so the crabs can have safe passage. So you've got to allow a lot more time and be a lot more patient so you don't run over them. I think what makes the Christmas Island red crab migration so spectacular is just the sheer numbers of crabs involved, 20 to 50 million of them, and also the synchronicity of it all. How do they all know exactly when to head off? They've all got to make it down to the coast to spawn on, it's a special tide, the last quarter of the moon. They have spring tides, and it's got to be before sunrise on that special tide, and all these crabs just emerge at the right time the night before, and they're on the coastline with all their eggs ready to spawn, and it's like you're in the middle of a nature documentary, middle of a David Attenborough documentary. I saw those documentaries when I was a kid, and I've always wanted to see that. It's like an incredible event. It's similar to, say, in Africa where you get all the wildebeest crossing the river, or it's just one of those grand spectacles that are just unforgettable to be a part of. It can be really tricky to predict, which is annoying for tourists sometimes, because it all depends on when the rains start. And the rains can come anytime from October to January. So after the rains start, then all the crabs start migrating, and then you can know which spawning date they're aiming for. But until then, it's anybody's guess. So tourists sometimes book in too early or too late, or it's a bit of a gamble. But one cool thing you can also see is if you're a month too late and the crabs have already spawned, after a month of the eggs being in the sea, they sort of hatch and then turn into these little tiny megalope crabs that are drifting around a bit like plankton. And then they wash back onto the island about a month later, and if you're really lucky, you just get this tide of red baby crabs all crawling up the rocks and flowing up into the jungle. And that is, I think, maybe even more spectacular than the actual adult red crab migration. I guess when most people think of crabs, they think of like coastal rock water kind of crabs. These are land crabs, so they actually live their whole life in the jungle. They live in burrows down in the earth, and they pop out and eat leaves and things like that. But they have that throwback to their ancestry where to spawn, they still have to make that trip down to the ocean to put their eggs into the sea. I guess when most people think about crabs, they think of like the coast and ocean crabs running around in the rock pools and that kind of stuff. These are different. These are land crabs, so they live their whole life in the forest, in burrows actually in the soil, and they pop out to eat leaves and things like that. But once a year they still have to go back to the coast to spawn. That's part of their ancestry, and for the first month of their life they have to be drifting around out at sea. So they're a unique kind of blend. They have to spend most of their life in the forest, but they still have to return to the sea. It's a very unique species. There's nowhere else on the world where so many crabs come down like this. The Christmas Island red crab just lives on Christmas Island. So after the females spawn their eggs into the water and they drift out to sea, they hatch instantly, and they spend the first 3 or 4 weeks of their life just drifting around out at sea. They're called megalopes, little like plankton critters, and they're just going around, and it depends on the ocean currents if they end up back on the island or not. Some years almost no baby crabs come back, but other years, like for the last couple of years, huge numbers come back, and the whole coastline can just be like a living red carpet of tiny little baby crabs all crawling up the cliffs and along the beaches, over houses even, and up into the jungle. I think that's possibly even more spectacular than the adult migration. It's I've never seen anything like it. You can just pick up handfuls of little tiny baby crabs.